I never expected to stand up during my daughter's graduation dinner and confront an entire table of people. I hadn't prepared a speech. I hadn't planned an argument. But when I looked across the room and saw my father sitting quietly with his eyes lowered, I knew I couldn't stay silent. My father, Howard, had always been a simple man, or at least that was what everyone believed. He lived in Dayton, Ohio, drove an old pickup truck, wore ordinary flannel shirts, and rarely discussed money. After my mother died when I was 14, he raised me alone. We didn't have everything other families had, but somehow he always made our modest life feel complete. I didn't take expensive vacations. I missed a school trip to Washington because we couldn't afford it. Yet there was always food on the table, my school needs were covered, and every Sunday, my father cooked the same roast dinner. He worked constantly, but whenever I asked what he did, he never gave me much detail. Eventually, I left Ohio, went to college, earned a civil engineering degree, and built my own career. I married Sylvia, and years later, our daughter Eleanor was born. She grew into an intelligent, independent woman and eventually completed her master's degree in architecture. When Eleanor's fiancé, Griffin, and his wealthy family arranged a celebration dinner, my father traveled to Philadelphia to attend. He rarely flew, but for his granddaughter, he was willing to do almost anything. The restaurant was elegant, expensive, and completely unfamiliar to him. Griffin's parents, Loretta and Prescott Alderman, were wealthy and accustomed to a very different lifestyle. They weren't openly rude at first. Instead, they asked my father polite questions in a tone that made it obvious they had already judged him. Loretta asked what he had done before retirement. "Manufacturing," he answered. "What kind?" "Industrial components, mostly heavy equipment parts." The conversation quickly moved elsewhere. My father didn't complain. He simply listened. Then, during dinner, Griffin's sister Waverly leaned toward her husband and made a comment about my father's clothes. She questioned whether someone like him really belonged with their family. Then she mocked his appearance, saying he looked as though he had walked straight out of a hardware store. I heard every word. So did my wife. And my father heard them too. The worst part wasn't even the insult. It was the reaction afterward. Loretta heard enough to understand what had been said, looked toward my father, and said absolutely nothing. My father simply stared at his plate. That was when something inside me snapped. I pushed my chair back and stood. Everyone became quiet. I told them my father had raised me alone after losing my mother. I reminded them that he had worked his entire adult life and traveled all that way simply because his granddaughter mattered to him. I told them they had judged him by his clothes, his truck, and the way he carried himself, and that they had completely misjudged the man sitting beside me. Then I looked at my father. "Dad, let's go." He folded his napkin carefully. "Thank you for dinner," he said calmly. Then he walked out with me. But neither of us knew that the real story was only beginning. Because later that night, my father opened an old bag, pulled out a folder he had hidden for decades, and showed me something that completely changed everything I thought I knew about him. Outside the restaurant, my father didn't seem angry. That was the strange thing. He adjusted his coat, looked at the street, and simply said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," I told him. He paused before giving me the kind of small smile he always gave when he didn't want to make a big deal out of something. Then he said almost casually, "The chicken was pretty good, though." My wife laughed. I couldn't, not yet. Later that night, my father and I sat together in the hotel lobby. We avoided talking directly about the dinner, Instead, we discussed Eleanor's architecture work, the condition of his truck, and a neighbor back home who was apparently making a mess of a home renovation. Then my father suddenly looked at me. "I want to show you something." He went upstairs and returned with an old duffel bag. From inside, he pulled out a thick manila folder. I had never seen it before. He placed it on the table. "I haven't told you everything about my business," he said. That sentence alone caught me completely off guard. My father began explaining. Years earlier, in 1987, he had started a small manufacturing company with roughly $11,000 he had saved while working at a machine shop. He called it Brock Industrial Supply and initially operated from a garage. He had only 2 customers. For years, he worked extremely long hours. I remembered him disappearing into the garage when I was young, but I had never understood what he was doing there. By the mid-1990s, the company had grown to more than 20 employees and occupied its own warehouse. He expanded into agricultural equipment components, a decision that eventually proved extremely profitable. By the time I entered college, the company was generating millions in annual revenue. I stared at him, but he wasn't finished. He had deliberately kept his success hidden from me. He explained that he had watched money destroy relationships within his own family. He didn't want wealth to become the foundation of my life. He wanted me to discover my own abilities, make my own mistakes, and build something without depending on a safety net I didn't even know existed. That explained everything. The old house, the ordinary truck, the simple clothes, the way he never complained, the way he never told me that financial help was available. Then he handed me another document. In 2019, he had sold the company. I looked at the final figure. $43 million. I read it again because my mind refused to accept it. My father, the man who had been silently judged at dinner, had built a company worth tens of millions, and he had never needed anyone to know. I asked him why he was telling me now. He looked at me and said that the people at dinner could think whatever they wanted. Their opinions didn't change who he was. He hadn't lived simply because he was unsuccessful. He had lived simply because that was the life he chose. That night, I barely slept. I thought about every sacrifice I had remembered from childhood. The school trips I missed, the clothes I didn't have, the student loans I carried after college. Then I realized something painful. My father hadn't failed to give me more. He had intentionally refused to make my life dependent on his wealth. The next morning, Eleanor called. She had spent the night thinking about what happened. Then she told me something I never expected. She had returned Griffin's engagement ring. And her reason had nothing to do with money. She said she had watched how Griffin's family treated my father and realized that she didn't want to spend her future surrounded by people who measured someone's value by appearances. But there was still one final conversation waiting for me. And when my father prepared to leave Philadelphia, he gave me one last piece of advice. One sentence that made me understand why he had hidden his fortune from me for all those years. What my father really wanted me to understand. The next morning, Eleanor told me she felt strangely relieved. She had loved Griffin, but the dinner had forced her to see something she had been avoiding. She realized that the problem wasn't simply one rude comment from his sister. It was the silence that followed. Nobody defended my father. Nobody challenged the disrespect. And that told her more than any argument could have. She returned Griffin's ring. I told her that the decision belonged to her. She had to live with it, not me. She understood. Before leaving Philadelphia, my father and I walked through the hotel parking garage. He carried his old duffel bag over one shoulder and a coffee in his hand. He looked exactly the same as he had the day before. Nothing about him had changed, except I knew the truth now. I told him I was still struggling with what I had learned. Part of me was amazed. Another part was frustrated that he had kept something so enormous from me for decades. He listened quietly. Then I asked him what I was supposed to feel. He looked at me and said, "How about grateful?" I didn't understand. He explained that I had built my own life without knowing what stood behind me. I had gone to college, worked, taken risks, paid my own bills, and created a career because I believed I had no other choice. That was exactly what he wanted. He hadn't wanted his money to become my identity. He wanted me to know that whatever I accomplished belonged to me. That realization changed how I remembered my entire childhood. The things I once considered limitations suddenly looked different. My father had been teaching me independence without ever giving me a lecture about it. He had built something enormous, but refused to let his success control our relationship. And perhaps that was the greatest thing he had ever given me. Months passed. Eleanor moved forward with her career and seemed happier. She stayed in touch with my father constantly. Their relationship became even stronger after the dinner. My father continued living the same way. The same simple habits, the same old truck, the same quiet personality. Nothing about his lifestyle changed just because I knew about his wealth. The Alderman family eventually contacted us once. There was an attempt at an apology, but things had already changed. Some bridges can be repaired, but they never look exactly the same afterward. The lesson my father left me wasn't really about money. It was about character. He could have walked into that restaurant wearing an expensive suit and announced exactly how successful he was. He could have embarrassed everyone at the table. He could have used his wealth to prove them wrong. But he didn't, because he didn't need to. The people who judged him thought his quietness meant weakness. They were wrong. His restraint came from knowing exactly who he was. That night, I stood up because I couldn't watch my father be humiliated. But afterward, I realized something even more important. He had never needed me to protect his worth. His worth had never depended on what anyone else thought. And that may be the most powerful lesson a parent can leave a child. Build your life so completely that other people's opinions cannot take anything away from you. My father had done exactly that. And after all those years, I finally understood the man who had raised me.